Hey everyone, welcome to a deep dive that I am so excited for.
Hmm?
We're going to be exploring the Quran, and I know that sounds like a lot, right? So we're breaking it down into three parts.
Oh, yeah.
For this first part, we are going to be just focusing on the first 50 verses
Okay.
out of 114 chapters.
Wow.
So it was really just like we're dipping our toes into the water.
Right.
But even in these first 50 verses, there is so much richness and complexity that I think is a great starting point.
Absolutely.
And to help us navigate all of this, we're going to be looking at a bunch of different sources. We've got various translations and interpretations, even some stuff from YouTube,
Ooh.
just to get a really multifaceted view of what's going on in these verses.
I love that approach because I think it just highlights how rich and diverse the interpretations of the Quran can be.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that's so fascinating about it, right? Like, it's not just a one-size-fits-all kind of text.
Mhm.
There's a lot of room for individual understanding and interpretation.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's something that we'll see even in these first 50 verses.
Okay, so right off the bat, what's something that jumps out at you from these opening verses?
Well, you can't really miss the emphasis on the oneness of God, right? Allah.
Yeah, it's everywhere. It's like it's woven into the very fabric of the text.
It's called Tawhid, and it's kind of like the cornerstone of Islamic belief.
So it's more than just saying, okay, God exists.
Right. It's about understanding that there is only one God and that everything flows from that.
Okay, so that's kind of like setting the stage. Like, this is the foundation upon which everything else is built.
Exactly. And it shapes how Muslims understand God's attributes, how they worship, and even how they interact with the world around them.
So it's not just a theological concept. It has real-world implications.
Right.
And it's not just about acknowledging this oneness passively, right? There are verses that call for complete submission to God's will, even using that word Islam, which literally translates to submission.
Yeah, that's a powerful word.
It feels pretty intense right from the start.
It is intense, but it's also about finding peace and purpose, you know? Like imagine surrendering to something bigger than yourself, aligning your life with a divine plan. That's the kind of submission the Quran is talking about.
So it's not just about obedience for the sake of obedience. It's about recognizing God's authority
Yeah.
and striving to live in a way that's pleasing to him.
Exactly, and finding that harmony in your life.
But there's also a lot of talk about hellfire and punishment for those who disbelieve, even in these early verses.
Yeah.
So how do you reconcile that with this idea of God being all-merciful?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's something that a lot of people grapple with. But it's important to understand that the Quran emphasizes both God's mercy and his justice.
Okay, so it's like a balancing act.
Yeah, the warnings about hellfire are meant to underscore the seriousness of rejecting God's message, but they're also a reminder of the importance of choice. Humans have free will, and with that comes responsibility.
So it's like a parent warning their child about touching a hot stove. The warning comes from love, from a desire to protect.
Exactly.
I'm also struck by how many stories about prophets are packed into these first 50 verses. Noah, Abraham, Moses, these aren't just names, they're epic narratives.
Oh, totally. And they're not just there for entertainment value, you know. They're woven into the text to illustrate key theological concepts and provide moral lessons.
Okay, so give me an example.
We'll take Noah, for instance. His story is a powerful reminder of God's power to save those who remain faithful, even in the face of overwhelming adversity. I mean, talk about perseverance, right? Building that ark.
Yeah, that's a whole other level of commitment.
He trusted God, and in the end, he and those who believed with him were saved.
Okay, so it's a story about faith and trust in the face of adversity.
Absolutely.
When you have Abraham, who was willing to sacrifice his son as a test of obedience, that's a story that's found in other Abrahamic traditions too. But what makes the Quran's version unique or particularly impactful?
The Quran really emphasizes Abraham's complete submission to God's will, his unwavering faith. This story highlights that true faith involves sacrifice and trust, even when faced with the most difficult choices. Wow.
Yeah, that's a tough one.
It's also important to note that the Quran uses Abraham's story to condemn idol worship and emphasize the purity of belief in one God.
So it's tying back to that central theme of Tawhid that we talked about earlier.
Exactly. It all connects.
Okay, so we've got this foundation of one God, submission to his will, and stories of prophets facing incredible challenges. Where does that leave us in terms of actually living our lives? Do these early verses give us any clues about how to be good people, how to build a just society?
Oh, absolutely. Even within these first 50 verses, we see the seeds of the Quran's ethical teachings.
Okay, like what?
There are verses that encourage prayer, charity, and honoring parents, all acts that promote individual piety and social harmony.
Honoring parents, that's a theme that resonates across cultures.
For sure. The Quran places a strong emphasis on respect and kindness towards parents. It reminds us that we owe them a debt of gratitude for bringing us into this world and nurturing us.
Yeah, that's huge.
And this respect for elders is seen as a cornerstone of a harmonious and compassionate society.
We've only scratched the surface, but it's clear that even these first few verses of the Quran pack a punch.
Yeah, it's amazing how much depth and richness there is in just these opening verses, and it's just a glimpse of what's to come.
So to wrap up this first part of our deep dive, I'm left wondering, what's the one thing you think is most important for our listener to take away from these initial verses?
You know that verse about God not creating the heavens and the earth in play? I'd say ponder that. Think about the implication that there's a purpose, a deeper meaning behind everything. That's a powerful idea that resonates throughout the entire Quran, even from these first few verses.
Wow, a lot to think about. Join us for part 2, where we will continue to unravel the wisdom of the Quran and see how it continues to shape lives and societies around the world.
Welcome back. I am excited to continue our exploration of the Quran.
I know, me too. Last time we talked about oneness, submission, those epic stories of prophets. What's next?
Well, let's look at how the Quran tackles the idea of revelation itself, how God communicates with humanity.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The role of messengers and even the challenges of preserving that message across generations.
I keep thinking about that verse about God not creating the heavens and earth in play.
Yeah.
There's a reason for all of this. It's not random, right?
Yeah, exactly. The Quran really pushes us to see the world differently, recognizing that there's this deeper meaning behind everything, this purpose that maybe we can't always grasp.
Okay, so if there's this grand design, this purpose, where does revelation fit in? How does God make his will known?
Well, that's where the prophets and messengers come in, right? They act as these intermediaries, delivering God's message to people across time.
Right, like a bridge between the divine and humanity.
Exactly. And there's this really beautiful verse in Surah Al-An'am that talks about how God has sent messengers before. Some we know about, some we don't.
Whoa, so there are prophets whose stories haven't even reached us. That's kind of a wild thought.
Yeah, and it suggests that revelation is this ongoing process, not just something that happened once and that's it.
It kind of makes the whole thing feel bigger, you know? Like we're just getting these glimpses into something much larger.
Exactly. The Quran acknowledges that we don't have all the answers, which I think is a really powerful message.
But if revelation is ongoing and we're only getting these pieces, doesn't that leave room for different interpretations?
That's a great point. And it's something the Quran addresses directly.
Really?
It actually talks about how previous scriptures were sometimes distorted, forgotten, or rejected outright.
Wow. So it's acknowledging that preserving the message is a challenge in itself.
Exactly. That's why it emphasizes the importance of safeguarding the Quran's message, making sure it's passed down and understood correctly.
It makes you think about that verse where it says God sent the Quran confirming what was before it, like the Torah and the Gospel.
Right. So it's building upon a foundation of shared truth.
So it's not about erasing or replacing, but about adding to and clarifying.
Right. And acknowledging a common thread that runs through these different faiths.
So even though there might be different paths, ultimately it's about seeking that same connection with the divine.
Yeah, I think that's a really beautiful way to put it.
So we've gone from this understanding of creation to revelation being this ongoing dialogue with God, with prophets as the guides.
And recognizing the importance of preserving the message, and even finding that common ground between faiths.
It's a lot to think about. So much more than just reading words on a page,
It is, and it just gets more intricate as we continue exploring the Quran.
Okay, before we go to the final part, what's one thing you want our listener to really think about from what we've discussed so far?
If revelation is this ongoing conversation, where do you fit into that conversation? How does what we've discussed so far, even these glimpses into the Quran, resonate with you personally?
That's a great question. Join us for part 3, where we'll see how the Quran's teachings are put into action, shaping lives and communities. Okay, so we're back for the final part of our Quran deep dive. And honestly, I'm feeling a little blown away by everything we've already talked about.
Right. It's been quite the journey so far.
We've covered so much ground, from those very first verses to this whole idea of revelation, the prophets, the challenges of preserving the message. But now I'm really curious to see how all of this, translates into actual living. How do these teachings actually play out in real life?
Yeah, I think that's where it gets really interesting, right? Because the Quran isn't just some abstract theological text. It's meant to be a guide for how we live, how we interact with each other, how we build a better world.
Yeah, exactly. So what are some of the things that jump out at you in terms of like practical guidance?
Well, one thing that's really prominent is this emphasis on social justice and communal responsibility.
Okay, so it's not just about like individual piety, it's about our obligations to the wider community.
Right. There's this constant reminder that we're not just isolated individuals, we're part of something larger, and our actions have an impact on others.
I remember in one of the YouTube interpretations we watched, there was this verse from Surah Al-Anfal that really stuck with me. It was something like, "And spend in the way of Allah, and do not throw yourselves with your own hands into destruction. And do good indeed. Allah loves the doers of good."
Ooh, yeah, that's a powerful one. It's like a direct call to action, right? Like, don't just sit there and think about being good. Actually go out and do good in the world.
Yeah, it's not enough to just have faith. You have to act on it.
Exactly. And you see that idea reflected in so many different ways throughout the Quran. Like, take the concept of zakat, for example, which is one of the 5 pillars of Islam.
Okay, refresh my memory. What's zakat again?
It's this mandatory form of almsgiving where a portion of your wealth is redistributed to those in need. It's about recognizing that your material possessions aren't just for your own enjoyment. They come with a responsibility to care for others.
That's pretty radical when you think about it. Like, it's built right into the fabric of the faith, this idea that social responsibility is inseparable from true belief.
Absolutely. It's about creating a more equitable society where everyone has the opportunity to thrive, not just the privileged few.
And it goes beyond just money, right?
Yeah.
Like in part 1, we talked about that verse that describes Muslims as the best nation produced for mankind. Some people might interpret that as like exclusive or even arrogant. But when you consider this emphasis on social justice, it starts to feel more like a challenge, like, live up to this high moral standard.
Exactly. It's not about claiming superiority. It's about setting a high bar for ethical conduct and striving to be a force for good in the world. The Quran is full of calls to, like, enjoin what is right, forbid what is wrong, and to be just and compassionate in all things.
Okay, so we've got social justice, communal responsibility, a call to action. But what about personal stuff, like family relationships, that kind of thing? Does the Quran offer guidance on those aspects of life too?
Oh, absolutely. Family is like the foundation of everything in Islam. And you see that reflected in the Quran's emphasis on, like, respecting your parents, being kind to your spouse, raising your children with love, and strong moral values.
There's that verse, I think it's in Surah Luqman, that talks about how a mother carries her child in weakness upon weakness. And then it says, "Be grateful to me and to your parents. To me is the final destination."
Ooh, yeah, that's a beautiful one. It's so poignant, It really captures the depth of love and sacrifice that goes into parenthood.
And it's so universal too, right? Like everyone, regardless of their background, can relate to that feeling of gratitude and love for their parents.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the things that's so powerful about the Quran's teachings. They're grounded in this deep understanding of human nature, our strengths, our weaknesses, our capacity for both good and evil.
It's not just about rules, it's about understanding what it means to be human.
Right, exactly.
There's this one verse from Surah Az-Zumar that I keep coming back to. It says something like, "Is he who is devoutly obedient during periods of the night, prostrating and standing in prayer, fearing the hereafter and hoping for the mercy of his Lord, like one who does not? Say, are those who know equal to those who do not know? Only they will remember who are people of understanding." It's a lot to unpack, but
Yeah, it's deep.
what I take away from it is that it's not enough to just go through the motions, Like, true faith is about aligning your inner world with your outer actions. It's about striving to live a life that reflects your values.
Exactly. And that striving is a lifelong journey, right? We're all constantly learning, growing, trying to become better versions of ourselves.
So it's not about achieving perfection. It's about taking those steps day by day to move closer to that ideal.
Right. And recognizing that we're all works in progress.
So as we wrap up this incredible 3-part deep dive, I guess the question is, what's the one big takeaway you want our listeners to walk away with? What's the heart of what the Quran is trying to tell us?
I think the biggest takeaway is that the Qur'an is a living, breathing text. It's not just some ancient artifact. It continues to speak to us today, no matter who we are or where we come from. and it's full of wisdom and guidance that can help us navigate the complexities of life.
It gives us a framework for understanding our purpose, our place in the world, our relationship with the divine.
Exactly. And it challenges us to think critically, to question our assumptions, and to strive for a deeper understanding of ourselves and the world around us.
It's been an amazing journey exploring the Quran with you, and I hope our listeners have found it as enriching as I have.
Me too. It's been a real pleasure.
And who knows, maybe this is just the beginning of your own journey of discovery with the Quran. So keep exploring, keep questioning, keep seeking, and thanks for joining us on this deep dive.